100 years ago, alcohol consumption was a major social problem. Truman even had a war on alcohol policy for 2 years. It just made the problem worse. George Bush administration had a cannabis problem. Black Americans were particularly harmed. He had a war on cannabis policy. It just made it worse. How did they solve this problem? Simple, legalize it. And that is the simplest path to victory from side affirmative. We're first going to prove that we will make drugs safer. We will secondly prove that people have a right to access these drugs. And thirdly, we will prove help with crimes. I would note that independently achieving any of these benefits on any side just wins us the debate. Firstly, let's set up then. We'll just make all drugs legal as the topic suggests, but we would first of all pre-sale tax these drugs, and secondly, we'll only allow legal vendors to sell these drugs. Basically, as per how any business runs, only licensed vendors would be allowed to sell these drugs. When selling, you would be required to do three things. First of all, give all information about this drug. Number two, suggest and have things like workbooks and textbooks to know how to use this safely. And thirdly, how to react when ODs and things happen. Very similar to how pharmacies give out information when selling things like morning after pills and stuff. How we will use this money is for general healthcare facilities. We'll use this money for more funding to hospitals, emergency rooms, etc. We're also fourthly obviously going to restrict the sale to minors. Stop taking drugs and entering clubs and stuff with it. Very similar to alcohol regulation, you can't drug and drive and stuff like that. That's going to be very similar to how we regulate alcohol. The first argument then is on principle and how people have a bodily autonomy to have access to these drugs. Four things under this. First of all, people just have the capability to make decisions. They should have the right to decide what happens with their body. Secondly, utility is something that is very subjective. If you ask a lot of people, especially people who like music, a short, exciting life for a lot of rock stars is more important than a long life. That is to say that a lot of people in the status quo would rather prefer to live 50 years of an exciting life rather than 80 years of life that's boring, that's boring and other things. This is analogous to people who are in contact sports, who do boxing. They know that they're going to get some sort of brain damage if they continue to play the sport. Muhammad Ali literally had dementia from this, but we did not stop him from accessing this because we recognize people have the ability to do this because they're the ones who have to suffer from it. Secondly, these are things like consuming unhealthy food, alcohol, engaging in high-risk occupations that give you more income, or even other forms of vices. We allow them to do this because generally the state and we recognize people have a principled right to do this. The impact of this is that the state does not have the capacity to make this decision. This decision should be for the people. The second prong of this principle is to explain that drugs sometimes help in self-discovery as well. Things like LSDs, things like hallucinogenics, often have reported people gaining new perspectives about things they like, about things they enjoy. We think this allows them future rights because they know themselves better. We would note that drug users oftentimes helps in pain medication. The difference, the side negative can come and say this also exists on their side, but note that the barrier to gain these drugs on their side is very hard. It's very hard to prove things like depression, especially in countries where mental health isn't available readily or is very expensive and you can't get a prescription. We think in these countries or in these situations we improve access to drugs and pain medications and stuff a lot more. But lastly, that most people find drugs fun. If people find something fun, I don't know why the state has to talk about them there. The third prong of this principle is why people consent, and people consent well. Three reasons. Number one, government has pushed the effects of drug use for a long time. Number two, media has highlighted things like drug use, people overdosing and stuff for years now. People know that there are side effects to consuming drugs. But fourthly, that people generally know other people who have consumed drugs before. There's a social safety net that exists here. That explains why on our side, people have the principal autonomy to do this. But also to push a burden on side negative, they cannot win this debate by explaining more people using drugs is enough for it. If more people use drugs, this is just people exercising a right they have. This is something you should recognize. The burden for neg to win this debate is to show that they have overarching harms to get away from by violating this principle. The second argument is that we make drugs safer. Three things here. First, drugs themselves are not harmful. We would note that drugs are generally just well researched. Secondly, people just wouldn't use them, they're unsafe. But thirdly, even if you don't believe these two mechanisms, that things like MDMA, things like morphine, which is literally just another version of heroin, etc., do just have genuine good uses. This explains when it is used by actors that are informed, when it is used by actors that are good, drugs themselves don't harm you. What are the things that actually do make drugs very dangerous? Three things. Number one, people not having enough information about how these drugs work. This is when things like overdoing them, taking in large amounts happen. This looks like things like lacing, when you mix some drugs with other drugs because you do not know that MDMA and heroin together will literally kill you. We think that small amounts of fentanyl won't kill you. In their world, these problems still exist because there's a lack of sophisticated information and technology. On our side, we solve that problem in three ways. Number one, the first way we solve this problem is that you do not have to interact with organized crime or bad actors anymore. So sale is better. Three reasons why. You're less likely to get blackmailed. Note that people often get coerced into things like, I will rat you out that you sold me drugs, I will tell you your family and stuff like that. We think blackmail just decreases because this is legalized. Secondly, point of sales are often quite shady. These are discreet. There are other forms of violence you're susceptible to. Gangs often have an incentive to frighten you so that you don't rat them out in later. That's particularly bad. We would also note that on our side, these things aren't laced anymore. You have better education, you have better supply. That just solves like the majority of these problems. Even if you don't believe that, what you should believe is that like literally with fiat of our setup, we help like people during OD. You're more likely to call the police or OOO if you have like given a friend a drug, but you know that's not a crime. You're much more likely to call the police. If you think that is a crime, you won't do that. You become irrational and you try to think of other ways you can escape the consequences. We think when you make it legal, you make it much more safer. This explains on weighing that that drug use is probably symmetric on both sides. Even if we have more people taking drugs, they use it safely. That wins us the debate there. The last argument is that we help with crime. The three mechanisms here. Number one, when you're arrested with supply, you go to prison. You're involved in like gangs. You're involved in prison crime. You lose opportunities for future income. Much more likely that you're going to continue crime. Second mechanism is you're likely to have like save police resources on our side. Strip searches reduce, gang busts reduce, policing of these problems reduces. The impact is that these forms of policing can be reallocated to other crimes like sexual assault, like murders. The police is often underfunded, so I think even if this is a marginal win, it's a win that helps a lot of people. The third mech here is that price is often high of these drugs because these are elastic, which means that gangs are able to spike up the prices of these drugs because there are very limited suppliers of these drugs, but demand probably stays the same on both sides. This looks like oligopolies or monopolies of supply of these drugs. This means that you give these gangs a lot of money. This means that capacity for gangs to expand increases a lot more. Things like trafficking, which is probably a lot bigger harm on their side, is supported by the money they get from getting these drugs. You need organizational structure to manufacture these drugs, so like gangs are probably the ones who manufactures in the first place. The impact here is that you run the gangs dry, you reduce their capacity to have this market, you decrease black markets, you replace them with licensed vendors. That's just good. We also reduce, like oftentimes, drug wars regarding market control. Lastly, note, when you weigh this argument, black Americans or marginalized groups like the Yaspados in Brazil are often the ones who have to deal with this problem because they live in a high crime area, but also that they're associated with other bad actors who are involved in these things. So the burden for side negative is not just to prove that they solve this problem, but that we solve this problem, they solve this problem better. Very, very proud to affirm.
As much as government legalize alcohol or smoking, for example, it is certain that it is still bad, and that is what side negative is trying to do. I'm going to tackle first, just do a bit of setup, and tackle the case and two arguments in my speech. First, just a bit of setup. What does legalizing drugs indeed look like? I think they simply need to legitimate any activity that involves production, the production of drugs, or just the reproduction and selling of drugs in general. But secondly, what is just the control model in our place? I think in our side, we will simply decriminalize the possession and use of drugs. This simply means that in our side, but we will prosecute buyers. We will prosecute sellers when they produce drugs, but we will not prosecute buyers when they consume drugs in the first place, right? This looks like if, for example, police stop an individual in the streets, for example, they can confiscate the individual, but not arrest or just decriminalize. But not arrest this individual, for example. We think that we will obviously then direct you to the rehabilitation process and all those things in the first place. But secondly, we think that in our world, why then more rehabilitation is just likely to take place. Just note in the grand scheme of things, it is simply harder to legalize laws for drugs, simply because the number of people who agree in the legalization of drugs in the first place is less. This simply means there needs to be more time for like parties to just to have the bargaining power needed to just legalize drugs in the first place, to get like more people in the chair or just in the House of Parliament, for example, to just agree to the legalization of drugs. This simply means that there will be more money spent in this process, and we will just allocate this money to do more rehabilitation in the first place. But secondly, I'm just going to tackle their instance. Note that most of their argument is entrenched in the narrative that legalization of drugs will make it safer to use of drugs. I think this is false in a few ways. Firstly, the main reason individuals use drugs is because of the side effects, right? It is when you get the boost of happiness in the short-term run. And note that in our side, this simply means that if you legalize drugs, the improvement of production will not look like you have less time being happy, but it will look like longer times for you to have this like short-term benefit for example, or like and this simply means that it will be harmful in a way. But secondly, perhaps you can argue that the production of drugs will not cause like long-term the improvement of production of drugs will not cause you like long-term effect or just like will not cause you being addicted. But this is untrue. Because why? The reason why individuals get addicted to drugs is not actually because of the substance, but the feeling of using drugs, which is like happiness and stuff like that. This simply means when you improve the production of drugs, companies simply have the incentive to improve the happiness that you have, or like the length of happiness that you face. This simply means that in all sides of the house, in all sides of the house, obviously addiction and all those stuff will still occur. I think this analysis is similar on how like you like ice cream, for example, and you're addicted to ice cream, not because there's like something contained in ice cream that there's like makes it addictive, but you just enjoy eating ice cream, for example. I think this is our case. But now onto my arguments. Why is drug just inherently bad? I think the first thing that I want to argue is just individuals cannot consent in using drugs, and note that this directly negate or just directly tackle their principle. First, I think people simply do not know the full information on how drug users affect their life. And this is exactly on how side Affirmative portrays that they need to do education in the first place, right? But note that perhaps companies try to do give education, but they never actually explain how that education will be likely accepted, given that individuals simply like the side effect of drugs in the first place. I think that is the most instances in which individuals will simply use drugs. But firstly, I think note in most instances, individuals are simply peer pressure to use drugs on how they are like living in an environment that use drugs, for example. Therefore, they will be peer pressure to use drugs. But secondly, within that, in most instances, there's like young people in most instances, young people are the ones who consume drugs, in which they are not fully developed. They cannot really understand what are the side effects in which these companies are talking about. But thirdly, the conclusion of this is just firstly, the initial condition of opting out is opting into the drugs is false. But most importantly, once you opt into the contract, you cannot opt out of the contract exactly because the nature of drugs is addictive, and you cannot start overusing it. This simply means that consumption will simply preclude you in many aspects of your life. For example, if you use drugs, obviously your family will be like, you'll be scared to be close with your family or friends, for example, exactly because you're scared that you're going to harm them. The conclusion of this is that in most of the instances, the safety coping mechanism in which you actually need in the first place is simply not available for you, exactly because you are trying to get away from it. So note that this actually directly tackles Anuru's affirmative principle argument on how they explain that people will be happier to have like short 50 years old as opposed to 80 years old. I think no, because when they give an analysis of like boxing, for example, the reason why individuals like boxing is not because people they like to get hit by the individual, right? But it's simply because they like making the money, for example, or just like they like fighting in general and they like the glamour of it, right? This simply means that this is different from the case of drugs, right? In drugs, obviously in the instance you only go for the short-term effect, and this is obviously different from boxing. I think the enjoyment of drug is not certain enjoyment, and this means this wins the case. But secondly, within the consumption of drugs simply ruin your life. This simply means uncertain that there's a lot of side effects in drug. For example, you become an irrational person, you engage, it's harder for you to engage in a social relationship, and these are certain harms. Thirdly, we think there's simply harmful medical effects in drugs, and this is certain. Obviously, there's more instances in which like you die, you overdose, simply there's like you have a bad mental and physical state when you use drugs, lower breathing capacity, for example, and all of this. But most importantly, the usage of drugs actually affect the people, those around you. This means that your ability to on being a good parent, for example, will be reduced. Your ability to connect with a relationship or just make your relationship will be reduced. The conclusion of all of this is that for the average person, which is in most instances in this debate, life is worse life is simply worse through consistent because of the consistent drug usage, which is bad. But why then, on our side, why then less drugs will actually be consumed? The first is obviously there will be harder access to drugs if it's not legalized. Like you cannot just go to the store and buy them. It is contingent upon you having a connection for all those drug cartels, for example. This really means for the average person, it's harder for them to get access to it. But secondly, we also limit the access of production of drugs, right? On how people cannot like do massive production exactly because it will the police will be like will take them off and cut them off the radar. But thirdly, within it's obvious the supply and demand market. We reduce the demand market. Obviously, then the supply market will simply reduce because there's more risk in producing drugs. This simply means that the legitimation of drugs. Firstly, you can buy, like in this side, you can buy at any store. There's a market incentive to market and persuade people. The comparative is that this is not the case. But the second argument is just why production of drugs should actually be, people who produce that should actually be punished. First, it's just that note that the consumption of drugs is certainly bad, which simply means that people who profit from those individuals who just morally harm or just like physically harm is something that is not justified, it's bad. But secondly, there's just social and addictive reasons that doesn't exist in the production of drugs, right? They do not, within a day, simply do not deserve the legal production when the harm that or the benefit that they give is actually harming people in the long-term run. Within that, people are simply deemed to go to prison if they ruin the other people's life. In this instances alone, we're proud to oppose.
The negatives come out today with a counter model that they will decriminalise all drugs. And the effect of this is essentially that any of their benefits that they name of rehab are completely symmetric under our side. But all our benefits regarding safety that pertain particularly to the selling of drugs cannot be claimed under theirs. Firstly, just the effect of their counter model. Secondly, what drug use actually looks like under either side of the debate. And thirdly, how we reduce the harms of drugs under our side of the debate. Okay, firstly, under setup. Decriminalisation of drugs. They claim that because they decriminalise drugs, that requires less fiat and therefore they can reallocate funds towards more rehab. It's unclear what benefit there is here because we have also metrics for increasing funding through our tax and excise situation. In the same way that we have an excise on alcohol, we have a significant tax on drugs. That funding can be reallocated to rehab. It's unclear why they would have substantially more rehab under their side. They also mentioned the safety issue, the kind of happiness doesn't come from that people seek the boost of dopamine from drugs and etc. etc. But again, we just like, as we mentioned at first, it's not like the drugs itself that's as dangerous as the opposition is claiming, which kind of leads into the second argument about what drug use actually looks like under either side of the debate, right? So the opposition has decided to come out with a counter model that decriminalizes drugs, which means a lot of potential harms, which just means all their benefits are completely symmetric under our side. So we've already explained how we don't get increased drug usage because of things like, there's a clear message from the government that drugs are bad. There's clear media messages that sensationalizes the worst case situations and overdoses of drugs. There are, on an individual level, there are societal pressures about why you shouldn't use drugs. Regarding the peer pressure argument the opposition brought up, if you are peer pressured, we think that's a harm that's completely symmetric under both sides of the debate. It's unclear why decriminalizing something would make less peer pressure around it, and we think in the cases where there is peer pressure, that means you see firsthand the impacts of drugs and any harms, and therefore you're able to consent to that more meaningfully. And that is to say, we think there is a very strong societal message that drugs are bad and drugs are harmful, and that legalization isn't likely to increase the use of drugs. But even if you were to believe that there is an increase in use of drugs, that's a harm that's completely symmetric under both sides because the opposition has decided to decriminalize drugs. So it's unclear why decriminalization versus legalization of use is going to reduce harms that way. We've also already explained why people do opt well into drugs, and for those who don't, we believe that, again, that is a harm symmetric under both sides because whether due to coercion, blackmail, peer pressure, etc., we think that's a situation that exists under both sides of the debate. we think that these people are the most vulnerable, and they are the ones who actually benefit under our side the most, because they're the ones who are most likely to be taking these drugs regardless, and our side provides safer procurement, safer drugs, safer protection measures in case of overdoses. So at the end of this, we don't think that drug use is likely to substantially increase under legalization, and certainly not any more than it would under decriminalization. But you still get, because of the societal pressures and barriers that still exist to taking drugs, but for those who are going to be taking drugs on the east side of the debate, we make it much safer under our side. Now to the harms and kind of like whether you can consent to drugs. The opposition has been pushing an interesting argument about how you can't consent to drugs because it's like essentially that it's addictive, so you can't consent to it, and they're after that boost of, you know, happiness, etc., etc. And they claim that this is different to sports, different to boxing somehow, because that's about money and glamour and not short-term happiness. We just don't see how this is true at all. If you look at sporting careers, they're incredibly short. You're subjecting to yourself to an incredible level of physical harm, a high level of brain injury for money and fame that disappears within like the 4 or 5 years the average sporting career lasts. We don't see how drug use is any different there, in that it's somehow harder to consent to the harms of drug use when you allow people to consent to much worse impacts on their health for money, etc. And really, the purpose of money is like money equals happiness, whatever, right? So it's unclear why this comparative, why the opposition is unwilling to accept this comparative. But regardless of that, the opposition has also suggested that, you know, there will still be significant harms under our side because they're unable to understand the side effects of drugs, and you're unable to fully understand the side effects there. I just fail to see what the opposition's comparative here is, because they're decriminalizing drugs. It's not clear that there is less drug use under their side. It's not clear that drug users somehow become magically more informed when drugs are decriminalized. Under our side, we provide you actual mechanisms as to how we'll provide information at the point of sale. We will regulate the production of drugs so that it is safer, so that you know what you're actually taking, you know how you're supposed to be taking it in the safest possible way. Yes, there are going to be side effects and negative health impacts, but we think that they are going to be significantly reduced because many of the harms of drugs currently is not because of the drugs themselves, which can be taken safely and are currently taken safely in medical context, but because of the unsafe practices regarding the production and procurement of drugs currently. So it's, if anything, under our side, drug users are likely to be more informed because they are handed information at that point of sale. It's unclear how they're getting more informed under the opposition side. We would argue they're not at all. The opposition also suggested that, you know, drug use is different because they can't opt out. It's an addictive substance. We think that there is still a level of initial consent there. Like, one, rehab existed. I think it is possible to quit if that is something you really want to do, but we do concede, you know, drugs are addictive. But we think that that is an addictive harm that we consent to in many other situations, such as alcohol, such as smoking, right? I think there are plenty of drugs that have been proven to be less harmful physically to you than alcohol, and yet it's more the societal perception that means that they are criminalized while alcohol is not. I think that this is an addictive harm that as a society we have conceded that you can addict to, you can consent to. We think beyond other addictive substances, things like a high-paying job that you can't really opt out of, otherwise you can't, you know, afford to feed your family. Like, those are things you can also kind of not opt out of, but we still, as a society, think you can meaningfully consent to them because they do bring a benefit to you. In terms of job, that is the money that buys you the happiness or like whatever you want in life. In terms of drugs, it's the happiness the drugs itself brings you, right? So at the end of this, what we get under our side is a significant reduction in harm because we're actually regulating what goes into these drugs. We're regulating how people are taking it. We're regulating the emergency procedures after taking drugs. We're regulating the kind of protective measures that go into that. We provide all of the benefits the opposition is trying to claim under rehab and so on. If anything, we have the potential to provide them better through continued funding of these programs through the excise. And the opposition under decriminalization because they're criminalizing the sale of drugs, right, the production of drugs, they cannot claim to regulate any of this, and they cannot claim any of these safety benefits, which will, and as I'm sure both sides can concede, people will be taking drugs under both sides of the debate. We simply make it safer for them to do so under our side. For those reasons, very proud to affirm.
Three things in the speech. Firstly, I'm going to try my hardest to delete the principle so you will not consider it at all at the end of this debate. Secondly, I'm going to talk about why there is just more drugs on net, and why that is incredibly bad and they don't sufficiently respond to it, and why that capacity and amount of drugs you have access to is by far the most important thing in this debate. Then I'm going to talk about how we accumulate most of the benefits of using drugs in more safe ways and preventing people from facing the worst excesses of drug use. Okay, firstly on what they say in the principle. They make three key claims. Firstly, they say that we allow people to make bad decisions. They make a bunch of poor analogies. I'm going to deal with them in turn. Firstly, these are far more predictable effects on your body and over time have been regulated, which is just, for example, that fast food used to be worse for you. The boxing used to be less safe because you had bad gloves, for example, but at the point where you legalize drugs, you don't have decades of built-up regulation to make these drugs as safe as possible, and they can't feed in at this point in the debate that they would do something like try and develop less bad drugs for you. Obviously, it's not something that they can claim to do, whereas there is years of regulation at the point where you legalize them, they still exist in the worst forms that we explained to you at first. Secondly, these reduce your autonomy to avoid harm way less, which is just to say that like choosing to eat fast food or participate in boxing doesn't affect others. You're making a choice to potentially harm yourself. But obviously behaving in certain ways on drugs obviously does affect others. It's things like making you more predisposed to domestic violence because you don't really know what you're doing, or you're more angry when you're on a substance like cocaine. It's things like potentially harming yourself or other people around you by creating trauma in like potentially taking your own life because you're under certain delusions or you're having hallucinations. It's things like, in general, losing your job and being unable to support your family because you got addicted to a certain substance that was very expensive or otherwise made you get fired because of the way that you acted at work. Obviously, boxing and fast food are completely unrelated to these things. But thirdly, we just explained that alcohol, firstly, in some cases, is like actively bad, and it's kind of unclear that this is a useful analogy for them to make, because alcohol is relatively underregulated under the status quo anyway, but also just note it's significantly harder to build your addiction to alcohol. Because when you try a drug in the first instance, it can hook you for life, but obviously it requires decades of significant drinking to build up a dependence on alcohol, and obviously this is something which you can't accrue in the first instance, and it's much harder to get addicted to. But also, lastly, just note the state restricts safety in many cases, which is just to say it forces you to do things like wear a seatbelt, because if you get in a car crash and eject through the windscreen, you're much more likely to die. But also, finally, obviously the examples that they provide don't affect others in the way the drugs do, which we just explained to you means the state should regulate it, because it's not a choice that the people around you can consent to you making, even if you're consenting to the choice in the first place. But lastly, we explained, even if you consent at the first initial choice, there's like 5 reasons why it's particularly bad when you consent to that choice and why this means you can't get out of it. Which is just to say, things like social pressures exist. People might try it way too young. They say that they would put age limits on it. But obviously, if you're trying cocaine in the same way that someone might slip their 14-year-old a sip of beer, obviously it's fucking way worse under their side for kids, because they get exposed to these drugs because they're around them more frequently, because their friends and family use them, and it's perceived as something which is okay to let a kid have once in a while. So even if you have restrictions on it, it can still hook them for life at the point where they try it. But also, lastly, because they do it while emotionally vulnerable or in bad places, and because they don't know how their body might react to it. Which is just to explain that in the cases where someone is particularly likely to react poorly to a drug, and it might kill them because they have a seizure where they try a particularly bad drug, at the point where they massively increase access and usage of drugs, that small percentage of cases just becomes like 20,000 people dying a year because their body has a rare condition which reacts poorly to drugs. Obviously, that's a massive, massive harm that they have to accrue under their side. But under either world, clearly, if you opt into it poorly in the first instance, which we explain that you do, and you believe, as we explained to you, the drugs are significantly more addictive and more destructive than all of the things which they explain, your choice to opt into it in the first place being poorly informed, massive, I guess, like, means that you're fucked for life now, because you're opted into an addictive cycle which can ruin your life over and over again. So this is obviously incredibly, incredibly bad. So the only way for them to defeat this then is to talk about there being symmetric access. So, why is there many more drugs under their case? I guess, why is there many more drugs under their side, and why does this mean that the likelihood that you consent poorly is incredibly high? Because I explained to you that even if you consent poorly in a small amount of cases, it's so destructive that we should never allow people to do it. Firstly, obviously your access net increases where you can buy it in incredibly legitimate ways. Because instead of having to find like your friend of a friend of a friend of a third cousin and organizing some way which is very shady and which you're not really sure about, and there's many checks along the way to stop you from doing it to get a drug like heroin or cocaine, now you can buy it at the fucking corner store. That's really bad. It's infinitely accessible to you as a person. And also, secondly, just note that they allow a massive production increase as well, which means that people are just much more likely to find them because they're everywhere in itself, because you can produce these drugs in far cheaper and more effective ways, because you don't have to hide a factory in the middle of the rainforest where it's hard to source labor because someone could get arrested for working in your drug plant. You can put them in like the middle of the city where you can produce drugs incredibly cheaply and efficiently the way that they do pharmaceutical companies in the status quo, which means that the capacity and the amount that you have access to expands. Thirdly, just note that you can fucking like market cocaine now. You can put like public ads out there that are trying to convince people that cocaine is good. And obviously the pushback to those ads is far worse because you're normalizing and suggesting to people that it's okay if you take these things because it's legal. In the same way that companies, I guess, like alcohol producers can market alcohol now, imagine drugs as destructive as heroin and cocaine being advertised in the counterfactual. But lastly, we just explained that that is incredibly important that that societal stigma is reduced. Because at every stage where you could have someone say this is a bad thing to take, or when you're taking it and someone sees you taking it, they might say maybe you shouldn't do that, maybe that could be bad for you. Obviously the messaging effect of things like regulations is just far decreased under their side. It means that people are likely to view it as more of a trivial thing, and obviously we explained the type of substances you're talking about that have been regulated and banned for decades obviously are not things which we should allow to escape into like the types of regulations that we have alcohol under now. Okay. I think that clearly proves that in the percentage of cases where you opt in poorly, where you're likely to destroy your life or your job, where you could get fired, where you could be more likely to abuse your wife or your kids, or whether it has a specific effect in your brain which means you could be mentally impaired for the rest of your life, if you opt in poorly in a small amount of cases, you're likely to get hooked, and that will ruin your life and is incredibly bad, and the amount of drugs that exist in the world and your capacity to access them is far higher, for social reasons, for capacity reasons, because the production expands. Okay, let's talk about taking drugs in safer ways. I'm going to explain 4 ways in which we co-opt all of the, or like half of the benefits that they suggest, and I'm going to outweigh the rest. Firstly, information about safe usage. Obviously, these are things that we can do as well. Things like rehabilitation, like decriminalization is usually involved with. Obviously, we just have the fear, I guess, to do things like give testing kits to people so they can avoid drugs being laced in the first place, like informing people about what is incredibly unsafe usage looks like telling people you should sanitize your needles effectively, and having, I guess, people to check up on I guess, like funding social services better so they check in if people are seen to be abusing drugs or neglecting or abusing their family members as well as a result of it. But lastly, we know that we do things like give funding to rehab as well, because if addiction is symmetric, massively increasing the amount of patients that you let into that system under their side is just likely to overwhelm those structures in the first place, because they don't explain why the funding that they would give to them, even if you accept that they do give funding to them, is enough to accumulate the massive increase in percentage of users that we explain. But thirdly, you can do things like contact law enforcement far better, because we don't press charges either, which means that it's often just like good that they go to officers and get, or like police officers see them and confiscates their drugs, because then they can't use those drugs in the first place. We explain why that's particularly bad, but also it means you're in the system more, which means even if you don't press charges, maybe we're able to point you effectively to resources that you view as particularly accessible to you and that are good for you to rehab. But also note that self-medication is mostly symmetric, because the most common types of self-medicating drugs are the most accessible ones. It's things like marijuana, which people use to reduce pain. Obviously, people can probably get them under the status quo. Lastly, I think we just outweigh all that stuff around crime around drugs, and also note it's often justified, or in cases where it's cracking down on the production of drugs. The largest instances of violence is like clashes with drug gangs in like different areas of the developing world. Lastly, they say their benefits are symmetric. Obviously, this is untrue because the stigma is important for lawmaking, which is just to say that moving to do things like pass policies, which I guess have safer drugs or like pass good rehab programs, means constantly telling people that it's okay to take these drugs. It's very hard for you to turn around and say we should regulate them, we should provide options, because people might abuse them in bad ways. Under the status quo, it's far easier where you have stigma, you acknowledge that people often don't have the consent to do so. Obviously, legislation is incredibly easier under our side. They use far more political capital, so proud to negate.
I'm going to start with the question of safety, because it's the only way this team can win the debate. We can afford to win this issue, but they have to win this by a huge margin to outweigh the principle, to outweigh the effect on gangs and things like that. The first observation I want to note is this team is incredibly lazy with their model. They say they're going to do things like decriminalize it, they say they're going to do things such as provide safe ways to use it, things like pill testing, all things that increase demand. I'm unclear why legalization is the thing that tips demand over that. But second thing I'm going to do is I'm going to explain that the number of people who use drugs in a poor way are probably the people who use it on either side. Because the people who are violent with drugs, the people who are addicted, are people who have other issues in life that make them vulnerable and make them prone towards using drugs, so they probably use them as well. But secondly, we explained that drugs inherently aren't that unsafe. Things like MDMA is used as an antidepressant, things like heroin is used as morphine, which is used in hospitals, it is things such as filling ingredients, it is things such as having to interact with gangs, it's things such as having rusty needles, which are the certain harms that accrue on their side, and the certain benefits that we are able to do that. But additionally, I would engage in some weighing. I would say that the people who use drugs in the status quo are the most vulnerable people. They're the people who the state has failed, they're the people who are pushed into poverty, they're the people who have lives that are so bad that they resort to drugs. The state has an obligation to make it safer for this group of people. So even if some people opt in, the people who are the most vulnerable are the ones who should care about it there. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to explain why the increase in supply is a benefit. Because we already explained that, first of all, it's probably not a supply problem. Things like marijuana and cocaine can be mass produced, gangs can have economies of scale to do this here. But secondly, I would flip this. They have mechanisms that also increase demand. But the problem here is if demand increases and supply cannot be increased in a good way, how you increase supply is doing things that are worse. It's such as adding filler ingredients, it's things such as stopping safety checks, it's things such as rushing production, which explains why in fact their increase in supply is a benefit. Because there's always an incentive to sell these drugs because you will make money there. But secondly, we would just explain when there's an increase in supply, you also do get better competition mechanisms. It's likely that people are able to call out competitors for having less safe drugs. It's likely they can call out competitors for having drugs that are necessarily addictive, and when they add things to have addictive there. We explains why when you have increased supply, the supply can adjust properly, which means that they don't cut corners, they don't do the things that actually kill people there. The only other mechanism they have as to why people increase drugs is you can market it, but obviously you can do that on their side. People can tell their friends to use it, and the point is to decriminalize possessing it. You can also do that their way. Secondly, I think drug dealers are more comfortable approaching people because it's a decriminalized thing. People are more likely to buy it in there. So that is explain that demand likely increases on both sides because this team is lazy, but supply increasing is a benefit for us. Next on rehab, they say that they can use rehab. I'm going to flip this. Firstly, we increase state capacity to engage in rehab. One, having a drug problem after you legalize drugs looks bad, so you have an incentive to spend money on rehab to solve this. Two, you can't push people to prisons and you can't remove the problem. So if people are drug addicts, they're on the streets, which explains why you have to solve that problem instead of incarcerating them there. So that increases state incentive. Secondly, we increase state capacity. Simply, we raise a lot of money. Drug demand is inelastic. And we explain to you that this probably kills the black market because people don't want to interact with the black market when there's a legal option because of the risk of being caught, because there are safer ways to do it, because they know the ingredients in these types of drugs there. So we indirectly get a lot of taxation money, which can go to rehab, flips their benefit, also goes to ER rooms, also helps make drugs safer there. That is a concrete benefit that we get there. Secondly, they say that to produce more drugs, they produce drugs that are harmful because they have incentives to make them more addictive. One, we can easily regulate this. We're the firm team. We have the ability to regulate. Obviously, we still criminalize people who don't have licenses and are producing drugs, but people who are licensed can do this in a good way. We can set regulations and stuff like that. Thirdly, they say that you still call 000 on their side because drugs are like decriminalized if you put off possession. But the problem here is often the types of people who do like give drugs to their friends can be still charged as suppliers. Let's say if you give your friend some drugs, you are still a supplier. So if you then call the police, you necessarily will also go to prison. You put yourself at risk there. And often people are irrational when they make this decision. They may think that the overdose is something that will fade. They may think that they may be able to get away with the person dying. They may think that they can get away with it. They don't make this decision rationally, which explains why they don't interact with services there. So the end of this issue, this team is incredibly lazy. We explain that the number of people using drugs is likely symmetric. When supply can increase, that is a good thing, but also this did make people safe, but in concrete ways there. Secondly, on crime, I would explain that this issue gets literally zero response from this team. 3N is way too late to respond to it. Firstly, we explain that this increases recidivism. Lots of people aren't drug producers when they're charged with selling drugs. They're people like students who gave a lot of money and do a one-off drug run, do a one-off drug distribution in their class and things like that. But when they do go to prison, this is something that does ruin their life and ruins the lives of their family around you. It means that you are more likely to do dangerous things, you're more likely to get involved in prison gangs, you're more likely to develop serious drug addictions yourself, and also you can't access jobs afterwards, which explains why you do increase the capacity with gangs to necessarily access higher labor there. Secondly, we explain that you save more police resources. Things like the things that they talk about, such as going into African American communities to see if there's drugs there so they can confiscate it, are things that take a lot of resources. We can use those resources and we can direct them in other things, such as helping police things like violent crimes, helping police things like sexual assault. With affirmative team, obviously we can explain how we reallocate resources there. Thirdly, we explain why gang violence necessarily increases, because on their side, the revenue is going to gangs. That means they can buy more drugs. That means that they can scale up their own productions. It means that they can cross-subsidize other aspects that they do, and they can do other things, bad things such as human trafficking that they do to a high extent here. I'd explain that these people are genuinely the most vulnerable for the reason that there's zero level of consent. People are trafficked by gangs, people are caught between gang shootoups, do not consent at all. People who use drugs have some level of consent, even that is imperfect level of consent, that is comparatively more consent to this step. Thirdly, on the principle, we would explain that it is just morally wrong for the state to criminalize it. Because we would explain that when the state, this explains why increasing usage isn't a meaningful harm. But secondly, we would just say it's morally wrong. Tracking someone in prison for giving them a friend a drug when they're asked for it is something that is bad. Going to the police, and we would also explain that this can be used to justify things like over-policing. How do they respond to this? The first thing they say is that they can decriminalize it here. The problem with this is it still gives police a reason to over-police these communities. And the problem here is even if it's decriminalized, often police don't know if you're supplying drugs or selling or possessing drugs. That's something that's determined after the fact. But when they try to arrest you, resisting arrest is also a crime. So they can find other ways to arrest you. They can find other ways to put you in prison, which is a bad thing there. It explains why decriminalization isn't sufficient there. Then they say there's a bunch of reasons why you cannot consent to them. Let's go through them. First thing that they say is that you are unaware. Notably, this is also the same as their predictability response, because that explains that you're unaware of how it affects you. One, we explain that the media has had an incentive to show overdoses over periods of time. Secondly, generally the government has had harsh, tough on drug crimes, tough on drug campaigns there. But thirdly, we just explain that people do have experiences with friends. They have friends who know how to use it there. So that explains that people just generally are aware. But notably, we would also explain that this also explains why your awareness of the long-term effects of drugs. People know that using drugs in the long term may mean that they have addiction here. I would say just because if in the long term you get addicted and you can't opt out of it, this isn't a reason why you can't consent to it. For example, if I go skydiving and I break my arm, or if I go skydiving and I lose a limb, obviously I consented to going skydiving and consented to that risk. But even though that risk is a long-term thing, that doesn't explain why I can't consent to it. So you can still consent to things that change your ability to do things in the future there. Thirdly, they say they're young. Obviously we can figure this out. If young people are coerced and pushed to consent on either side, that's something that's mentioned to a decriminalization case there. But thirdly, they say that it affects others. Clearly this is exactly the same as things like alcohol. But we would just explain what affects other people more are the harms that we describe. The harms of police, over-policing families, the harms of people going to prison, not being able to provide for their family, parents being left as single parents. Obviously those are harms there. At the end of this debate, what should you believe? This was a negative team that was incredibly lazy. In the intent to co-opt everything by telling people how to use drugs safely, by telling people that they'll decriminalize it, they get the increase in demand. What they didn't have was an increase in supply that could make that safe. But they also did encourage crime. They gave the money instead of the government to gang actors, and that was bad. But at the end of that, people did have a right to their own body and how they used it.
Sometimes debating is a very simple game. If you believe a depressed 18-year-old is more likely to buy ice if it's available cheaply at Liquorland, we simply win this debate. Because the state just does have an obligation to prevent the most vulnerable actor from ruining their lives. At the end of this debate, if you believe less people consume drugs and that drugs are bad, we've won. Their only response to this is by saying that people already consume drugs and that the people who are likely to consume drugs badly exist on both sides of this debate, so therefore we don't actually increase the amount of people who consume drugs badly. But obviously, we explain why more people get addicted if you decrease the barriers of entry to consumption of drugs. Which means, I'll go through this at length slightly later in my speech, but if you believe that we decrease barriers of entry, we win the debate on that metric alone. First question then, which side decreases the negative effects of drug consumption? And note, this is just the most important issue in the debate for two very simple and obvious reasons. First of all, these people are the most vulnerable, as we explained that these people cannot consent, and they can have their lives ruined by the effects that these drugs will have on their lives. I think we should all agree that that's true by this stage in the debate and just intuitively on the merits of these claims by themselves. But second of all, these people are victims of society that have pushed them into the position where they are taking these drugs, and as opposed to criminals or other people who have largely harmed others and have created bad effects on the people around them, which explains why you should care much more about victims who cannot consent as opposed to criminals who have more agency in making these choices. Their claim here is that drugs get safer when production is done legally, as they say that these people are more educated on how to consume these drugs, and they don't have to engage with criminals that will make the drugs that they're consuming more dangerous, like splicing them. The problem here is, first of all, it's deeply unclear why education isn't something that the average person already has an awareness of the fact that drugs are bad, and we would also accept that we're able to increase education on our side, which means people already in the status quo opt into these drugs, even though they're aware that they might have bad effects on them, which means the education argument cannot get around the fact that people will engage in drugs badly, even if they are educated to the nth degree. But second of all, now we've just created a world where literally Big Pharma has an incentive to lobby the government to change norms to keep you addicted, which is an incredibly harmful outcome for this opposition team. Because whilst they say that people being more educated and being more informed might mean they're able to consume drugs effectively, we explain by giving the biggest corporations in the world an incentive to make you not informed and to continue consuming their products is just incredibly harmful for your ability to engage in these products well. Thirdly, we explained why there are obviously inherent risks to drugs, which means even if you try and make it as safe as possible, you cannot just get around the fact that if you consume ice, you're likely to overdose because maybe you get a bit skinnier and you take too much of it. Maybe because it just ruins your internal health systems, no matter how safely you're consuming it. Maybe because you trip and you jump off a fucking bridge. There are so many inherent risks to the consumption of these drugs that you cannot get away from by making it safer. So, first, we explained why giving Big Pharma an incentive to do the opioid crisis with a more addictive, more harmful drug explains why there are significant harms to the ability to make this safer. And second of all, we explained why they have maybe they have a slight benefit to the They have a slight benefit to making it slightly safer because maybe it's slightly more educated and there's slightly less spicing. But we will explain why on the way up it is incredibly more important to decrease the amount of people who are taking these drugs than make it slightly safer. Why is that true? First, now we've explained why substantially more people are consuming these drugs as opposed to the small benefit to safety that they might have access on their side. Because you can do it out in a pub more openly, which makes it a much more social activity. Because you can buy it at the store, which means it's cheaper and it bypasses any access issues. Because Big Pharma markets it and legitimizes it to the public population. Because production is easier and it's produced. Because it's fucking cheaper. All of these explain why there's substantial decreases to the barrier of entry, which means way more people do this, which means they might explain why the per user, the drugs become safer, but we explain why there's a substantially larger increase in the amount of people who consume these drugs and why that means that they're worse off. But second of all, why is this just a big win on the way up for us? As we've explained, you cannot take the inherent risks out of drugs. Note how this has existed in the opioid crisis, which is relatively more safe and relatively and more regulated. That is still something that has an incredibly dramatic effect on people's lives. You cannot run away from this by making it slightly more safer. But education can't solve these problems as well, because not everyone likes to read them. Not everyone cares, and the harm still accrues. But thirdly, even the safest use of drugs still have these terrible effects on your life, on your drugs, on your health. They explain why people are already addicted, but we explain why getting more people addicted in the long run is a much more important harm. And second of all, it's hard to minimize the effects of drugs, and any usage will fuck someone's life. Which means at the end of this issue, you should believe that whilst it might be true that they get slightly safer usage of drugs, I do not care, because I would prefer a world where less people are consuming drugs. They say, well, now it's better because they will do more rehab and they'll make the end process better because they have a political desire to solve the problem if there's a bunch of people on the street and because they can raise a lot of money with taxes. But I would note here, if you accept that they get better rehab because they have a political incentive to take people off the streets, we've already won this debate because the people had to be on the streets in the first place, right? Because that political desire only arrives after the harm has already accrued, where we've already won. But second of all, money won't always go there, which is what we explained at Felix, which is just to say we get the political capital to say that all of the effort in passing this law will use that to pass laws for rehab. they say, we'll put a tax in place, but obviously you can change the direction of the tax in the long run. For example, the tax on beer that exists in Australia does not all go to alcoholism rehabilitation, because people have legitimized the tax, legitimized the consumption of beer and do not care about rehabilitation. The more you legitimize the consumption of drugs, the less there is an imperative to solve it, because it's viewed as a legal activity in society, which just explains why in the long run you actually get more rehab under our side, because people view it as more of an issue, but under their side they don't care nearly as much because it's legal. Their final explanation here is just to be like, well, if we are better because we win on the side of people who are criminals, people who are in prison. They say it's going to increase recidivism if you'll go to jail, which might be true. But you know what increases recidivism more than going to jail does? It's being addicted to ice, because it means you cannot get a job, it means you do not have enough money, you do not have a family, you do not have a home, all of which pushes you into the position of where you're forced to go into criminal activity, which explains why, whilst they might be correct that recidivism might be slightly worse for the criminals on their side, I would suggest prison and people being forced into prison is a bigger issue under their side, because more people are addicted to drugs. They then say, well, but also we would say we care much more about the people who, like the victims involved in this situation, because they cannot consent. Their final claim and attempt to win this debate is explaining how they win on the principle, because they say the state should restrict it. A couple issues with this principle. First, the state frequently restricts people's liberties. It forces people to wear a seatbelt, and it bans people under their side from doing drugs if they're under 18. There are two things you need to understand to know that this principle doesn't work. One, do people act irrational when opting in? Yes, because they're addicted. And second of all, do the harms outweigh the benefits? And if the answer to that is yes, then their principle doesn't stand, because the state actually has an obligation to prevent people from doing things that are bad for them if they opt in irrationally and the harms outweigh the benefit. Obviously, we explain why the harms do outweigh the benefit, because it can ruin someone's life, and we explain why they opt in irrationally, which means this principle doesn't activate. At the end of this debate, we would suggest that the state not only is not principally liable for banning these drugs, in fact, they have an obligation to do so to protect their citizens.